to join us for the premiere of a webinar series that I'm starting on. The topic tonight is what really matters at the end of life. 7 lessons from living, from stories of the dying. And we have a special guest on tonight, Dr. Karen Wyatt, so we're really in for a special treat. And before we get started, let me just introduce myself. My name is Kim Adams, and for those of you who aren't familiar with me, that I don't have the pleasure of already knowing or connecting with, I'm a certified professional coach, and I specialize in end of life and grief, and I'm a hospice volunteer, and I've also done a lot of bereavement work through hospice. In addition, I'm also an end-of-life educator, and I'm the host of this webinar series that you're tuning into tonight. The first of a year-long series, once-a-month free series, entitled Vital Conversations, Dialogues on Living and Dying Well. And just a little bit about me, that I've always been interested in death and dying, and I've really had not much fear at all. I know that in our culture there is a lot of fear around that, but I've always, ever since a young age, had a real sense that we were more than our physical body, and that we move through the life cycle just like every other living being. You know, it's just a natural part of our life cycle to be born, you know, you're a toddler, an adolescent, young adult, a senior, and then we pass. We do live in an assumptive world that is how things progress, but that isn't always necessarily the case in terms of that. And I'm sure all of us have stories and family members and friends and things that is not their experience. But what's been important for me, and one of the reasons why I have started this webinar series, is the importance of opening the door to the conversation. And so through this webinar series, I really hope to do just that, through various topics and experts in the field of end of life and dying, to really be able to open that door so that people feel more comfortable, it's more normalized, that we do begin to talk about the fact that this is a natural, normal part of our life. So again, as I said, we're in for a real treat tonight with Dr. Karen Wyatt, who's kicking off this series, and in a moment we will welcome her, but let me just do a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. Number one, we are live, so you know, with any technology, it's great when it works, and we are expecting no issues tonight. However, if your screen should freeze or something goes a little wonky with your computer, 9 times out of 10 it's actually on your end, so just refresh your browser and you should be fine. The other thing to just let you know is that you'll have the ability to interact with Karen and I tonight, because on your screen there's a chat function on the side. So actually feel free right now to just type in and say hello and let us know where you're calling from. We have a large number of people that have registered for this, so we'd love to be able to hear where some of you are calling in from. So that is a little bit of the housekeeping, so let's get started. Let me read you Dr. Karen's official bio, and then we'll hear more from her and her story. So Dr. Karen Wyatt is a family practice physician who spent most of her 25-year career in medicine caring for patients in challenging settings, such as nursing homes, hospices, free clinics, and homeless shelters. Her work with patients who were facing the end of their life inspired her to write her book, What Really Matters: 7 Lessons for Living from the Stories of the Dying, which describes the spiritual lessons she learned from her hospice patients. Dr. Wyatt also hosts an online interview series entitled End of Life University, which we will hear more about later, which features interviews and conversations from all aspects of the end of life. She has won numerous awards for her volunteer service, including the Spirit of the American Woman Award, and being named one of Utah's 100 Notable Women. She's been featured in USA Today, Publishers Weekly, the Huffington Post, Shift Magazine, Light of Consciousness Journal, the Denver Post, and numerous medical journals. Dr. Wyatt teaches that in order to live fully, We must each overcome our fear of death and embrace the difficulties that life brings us. She is an inspired teacher who truly embodies the message she brings to the world. So Dr. Karen Wyatt, welcome.
Hi, Kim. Thank you so much. And first, I want to say congratulations to you on launching this new webinar series. I'm so excited for you, and I think it's going to be a fantastic addition to the content that's out there in the world. And I'm very honored to be your first guest. So thank you for having me.
Great. Well, thank you. It certainly is my honor and pleasure and privilege to really have you join us on this, to really launch this series, The Vital Conversations, Dialogues on Living and Dying Well. And so our topic tonight, what really matters at the end of life and how we prepare for that now, is an extremely important topic. And judging from the more than 210 people who registered for this webinar from 5 countries, I might add, New Zealand, Canada, the Netherlands, the UK, and the US, it's clear to me that people want to hear more about this. And so, and just checking the chat, I see, thank you, I see people are checking in, Albany, New York, Florida, Chico. We just have people checking. It's just scrolling so fast that I can't even see it all. So great, thanks so much, and keep checking in and use that chat for comments, questions, which we'll be able to get to. Dr. Wyatt and I will probably talk for about 30 minutes or so, and 35 minutes, and then we'll have the opportunity to answer some questions and see how things go from there. So without any further ado, let's get started. You just heard Dr. Karen's bio, so let's hear a little bit, Karen, about your story and how you got involved in this work.
All right, thank you, Kim. Well, as mentioned, I'm trained as a family practitioner, and it was early in my family practice career. I was just running a primary care clinic, a brand new doctor really in practice, about 3 years into practice, when my own father died, and he actually committed suicide. And that was a complete game changer for me in my life. I was obviously devastated by the loss of my dad, but in particular for me, because I was a physician and I treated a lot of depression. I had had a number of suicidal patients. I really had a hard time coping with Dad's death and his choice to take his own life. So I just plummeted into extreme grief, and I know you know about this, Kim, from the counseling that you do. It was really complicated grief because of the nature of his death. And for about 3 years, I struggled desperately trying to get out of the black hole of grief I was in. And one day I got an inspiration that maybe I need to volunteer for hospice. And at that time I really didn't know anything about hospice except that they took care of people who were dying. And so, but the idea just popped into my head, call hospice. And I honestly, I didn't even know if my community had a hospice. So that's how little I knew. I didn't know if there was one. I had no idea exactly what they did, but I called that day. I found a hospice in the Yellow Pages, and I called and said, I'm a doctor. I don't know if you take volunteers. Is there anything I could do to help you? I feel like I should volunteer for hospice. And the director of the hospice on the other end of the phone said, what made you call us right now? And I said, I have no idea. I said, I just got this idea. And she said, because our medical director just resigned 30 minutes ago. And we've been in a panic about what we're going to do because we can't operate without a medical director. And she said, since you're a doctor and you'd like to be a volunteer, would you consider being our medical director? So just like that, I started working in hospice. That day I became a hospice medical director. And it's been a really interesting journey ever since then, and obviously it was the right thing for me. As soon as I made my very first home visit to a patient, I knew this is what I was meant to do. This is my calling and my purpose, to work with patients who are dying. And I loved hospice. I did it as a volunteer part-time and ultimately gave up my primary care practice and started doing hospice full-time. And as I said, I got involved in the beginning to help me deal with my own grief. And at the time, I was thinking, I'm completely lost in this very dark place, and I cannot find my way out. And maybe if I just go immerse myself in death and dying, and I face it every day and deal with it with other people, I'll find a way out. And for me, that is what happened over time, is really working with dying patients and their families helped me explore my own grief, helped me understand my dad and his frame of mind at the end of his life, and really helped me heal over time. So indeed, my grief did resolve as I worked in hospice. But another thing that happened is that I just discovered that these hospice patients that I expected to be very sad, I expected this work to be so depressing that I would go every day and just feel sad, and I would cry with people, and I thought that's what it would be like. And I was so wrong, because I discovered right away that many of the hospice patients I worked with were actually joyful and actually fully alive in a way that I was not alive. And so that got me thinking a lot during these years, like, what is it that these people know that I don't know? What do hospice patients know that the rest of us are missing out on? And how is it possible to be dying and yet be joyful and enjoying life at the same time? And so I became a student, in a way, of my patients. I started really listening to them and asking them questions and sitting at the bedside and learning as much as I could about this dying process and how it seemed to transform people. So for me, that became a huge spiritual awakening for me. I had already been on a spiritual path and had already been kind of developing my own spiritual ideologies, I guess, and practices. But it was working with the dying that really crystallized everything for me and helped me see clearly. And after a number of years of working with patients and dealing with these spiritual lessons I was learning from them, the idea came to me that I need to write a book about this. I need to write these lessons for other people. And in fact, several of my patients said that their biggest frustration was that they had just begun to understand what's important about life, and yet not only did they not have very much time to live it themselves, they didn't have the means of teaching other people about what they had learned about life. And so that's what made me realize, but I'm still here, and I can be their mouthpiece. I could write their stories, and I could teach people what I was able to learn from them and share that with other people. So that was the impetus behind writing the book, What Really Matters. And the reality is it took me 12 years to write that book. So it didn't come easily. And a friend of mine at the beginning, when I was just starting to write it, a friend of mine who's my writing mentor said to me, you're going to have to live all the lessons in that book before you'll be able to write it. And she was right. That's why it took me 12 years. I had a lot to learn and a lot to process within myself before I could really understand these spiritual lessons and be able to write the book. So for me, the book itself was a huge crowning achievement that came about after all the years of hospice work and then 12 more years of working on the lessons in order to write it. Wow. So that's kind of how I came into this world of writing and talking to people and speaking through that inspiration that came from hospice.
Wow, what many gifts that you've received when you took that step way back to say, you know what, I need to kind of begin to deal with this grief and just contacting that hospice. Look at the trajectory that it really has put you on. So yes, Yes, and beautiful. I've read your book, and I certainly would encourage others to read it. It's just so practical and applicable. And I love how you say that you are able to be the voice for those that were dying, to really share what it was that really mattered to them in those lessons. And you've also, just to kind of put in terms of some of your additional work, was you've created the End of Life University. Tell us a little bit about that before we jump into some of the lessons that we want to talk about tonight.
Yeah, well, what happened is that I left medical practice altogether in order to write the book. I couldn't get it written while I was still working so many hours a week in medical practice. So 5 years ago, I made another big leap, a big commitment to get the book written, and left practice and took off on an entirely new career path as a writer. And the book was published 3 years ago. So over the course of 2 years, I wrote the book and then got it ready for publication, and it came out almost 3 years ago. And what I found at that time is that there was still a lot of resistance to death and dying. I found that I was trying to take the book around, trying to get people to book me as a speaker or listen to what I had to say, and I found so much fear and resistance in the general public around death and dying. And I tried to tell them, but this book, it's not depressing. It's uplifting and it's hopeful. It's all these lessons about how to live. But as soon as people knew, oh, wait, there are stories of people dying, no, we're not interested. We don't want to hear about that. And so it made me realize just the extent of the societal problem we have of denial about death and dying. And I've been plugging away all this time at how do I get people to open up? And just like you were saying, Kim, like really open the conversation. And at the end of 2013, I got the idea that maybe I could do a series online and interview people about death and dying. And so I did my very first little series. It was over 5 days of time, and I had 3 to 4 interviews a day and interviewed people in the end of life. And that was my first foray into doing these interviews. And I decided to name it End of Life University because I decided to make it a place where people could come and really learn about end of life and learn about it from many different perspectives. I had such a good time doing those interviews. It was so fulfilling and fun for me, and I met amazing people and learned so much that I decided last year I'm going to keep doing this. And so all last year I did 2 interviews a month that I publish online for people to listen to, and I'm continuing it this year. It's been a blast for me doing the interviews and meeting the people and just hearing incredible, heartwarming stories from the people who share in those interviews. And it's been so inspiring. And so in a way, I stopped trying to promote my book because I was struggling with that. And I recognized the real problem is we just need to open people's minds and start having conversations. And my hope is that the more conversations there are, like this one and all of your webinars you'll be putting out, Kim, and then the End of Life University interviews, the more we'll be getting people from the general public to join in and listen to what we have to say and start to overcome some of their own fears and their own denials about death and dying.
Yes, absolutely. And I think any medium, to really open the door to those conversations, and, an audio series that you do is just fantastic. I'm going to put on the chat for people I just displayed it, the End of Life University website, where you can go and you can see the interviews that Karen was just speaking about, or listen, I should say, to those interviews that Karen was just speaking about. And they're over a broad range of topics and things, again, to just really begin to open the door for the conversations and encourage people to really, talk about something that it's going to happen to all of us. And so being able to diminish, as you say, Karen, some of those fears. If we bring things out into the light, bring things into the light from the darkness, it takes away a lot of the power. And so I think a lot of times, people just don't want to even approach the conversation or the discussion, but being able to have supportive places and speakers and topics and things that can kind of open people's minds to say, oh, wow, okay, that wasn't so bad. As you spoke about, your book, I can certainly imagine that people were saying, oh, it's about death and dying. Oh, I don't want to deal with that. But when you were able to really explain it a little bit more and people were really hearing that this is more than, and it's beautiful stories, beautiful lessons. Again, I've read the book, and I just encourage people, because it's just another opportunity to be able to share something that's so vitally important. So great. So our topic, Karen, was about what really matters at the end of life. Mm-hmm. and the way that we live our lives now prepares us for this. So what really does matter at the end of life, and how do we prepare now for that?
Well, as I was saying, what struck me when I started working with hospice patients is that they seemed to know something that the rest of us didn't know. They seemed to have something that I wanted to have, and I began studying that and trying to figure out what is it that they see in the world that I'm missing somehow, that I'm missing out on. And the first thing that I recognized is that they understood that life is precious, life is fleeting, and it vanishes before our eyes. It comes and goes so quickly, and that those patients who are so close to the end of their lives had really discovered how to cherish every single moment. And because they didn't know for sure which moment would be their last. And it was powerful to sit with patients and watch them and observe how much they enjoyed watching a sunset, not knowing if it might be the very last sunset they would ever see, and how fully they engaged with that sunset. Or watching another patient eat a dish of ice cream and just savor the taste of it and the texture and enjoy every bit of the ice cream. And it made me recognize for myself how much I was missing that aspect of being fully present with whatever I was doing in the moment. And as I thought back, I thought of, I would go out to dinner in a restaurant and even be in the restaurant, sitting there eating, thinking, I should come here again someday so I can really enjoy it. Instead of realizing, I'm here right now. Why am I not enjoying it right now? The reason I wasn't enjoying it in the moment is because my mind was elsewhere. My mind was off worrying about something I had to do the next day, or reprocessing something I'd already done, making lists in my head, instead of actually just being in that restaurant, enjoying everything about it. My mind was somewhere else. So it became very clear to me that I needed to learn how to be present in the present moment. And that became one of the first lessons I started working on for myself. Like, how do I just focus in on what I'm doing in the moment and really enjoy being in that moment? And I came to understand beyond that, that's what made the end of life very beautiful and transformative for many hospice patients, is that they were able to fully engage with each moment of life they had left. And that if I could accomplish that and live my entire life that way, I would get to the end of my life and feel like, wow, I've had an incredible life full of meaningful moments that are just packed with sensations and observations and experiences and love. So that became the first thing that I discovered that I needed to learn about. And quickly, the next thing that I observed that my patients were really talking to me about and teaching me was about the importance of love. And I would say almost every single patient brought up the idea of love and how important love became to them. It became all-consuming in some ways in their last days of life, to make sure they had a chance to tell people that they loved them, to make sure they could reminisce about feeling loved and experiencing love in their lives. So so I recognized the importance of love, and not that I hadn't recognized that before, but I hadn't prioritized love. I always knew love was important, but I hadn't prioritized it so much in my own life. So what I was discovering is that when you can stay in the present moment and be fully here and alert and aware and focused on what's happening, you can do a much better job of loving, of giving and receiving love, because love exists in the present moment. It's not in the past or the future. It's right here, right now. So those two things came together very clearly for me, that being in the present moment and experiencing love. And for me, the issue I had to struggle with was how to receive love, because I was a caretaking person who was used to always giving and taking care of others, and I hadn't really addressed the idea of how do you receive love. And I witnessed that with many of my patients, because suddenly they're in a vulnerable, helpless role and having to receive love and care from another person. And I watched how some of them struggled with it. It was very hard for them to be dependent and need someone else to love them. And I realized that's actually how I am all the time. I'm that way also. I don't know how to accept or receive love. So that became very clear to me. So the third thing that followed naturally from those two lessons was the idea of forgiveness. And I recognize that as soon as we begin to genuinely and deeply love the people in our lives, forgiveness becomes necessary, and that forgiveness is really goes hand in hand with love, because every person that we care about and commit to is a human being who will let us down in some way, or betray us, or forget about us, or have a bad day, and we will be hurt over and over again by the people we love. And that makes forgiveness a necessity. If we're going to move forward and advance and learn how to deeply love, we have to be able to forgive, because we get hung up. If we can't forgive, we get hung up again, and that's actually takes us back in the past. We get stuck there. So forgiveness was the third lesson, the third thing that really matters. And in the book there were seven lessons, but I just wanted to focus on these three because they all go hand in hand. Staying in the present moment, practicing love, and actually making love our highest value, so that in every situation when we have a choice to make, love becomes the guiding force that helps us decide which way should I go, what is the most loving choice I can make in this moment. And then constantly practicing forgiveness so that we let go of all the slights and all the wrongs and all of the wounds that have been given to us over time, and gradually let go of those to release more of our energy to be in the present moment again. So for me, those three things became very, very important as I observed my patients and saw what they were struggling with and learning from, and became really the focus for me of what I needed to learn in my life and what I needed to work on day to day for my own spiritual growth.
Isn't it beautiful that, from your patients, we are students and we are teachers, and so what the amazing things that you learned from your patients, that you realized these apply to me. These are things that I need to either pay attention to or work on, and as you said, just in your caregiver role, that it was so difficult to receive love, because you were always such the giver. So yeah, how beautiful. I'm just curious, Karen, if because I read your book, and if you'd be willing to share one of the stories. I'm thinking about the story of Greg and his two brothers. It seems to all three of those lessons that you talk about seem to really be a beautiful example in this story. Is that something you'd be okay with?
Oh yes, yes. It's one of my favorite stories. that this was a family that we got called in to work with them kind of near the very end of this whole process, and there's a huge story that had taken place before hospice even came on the scene. And it was the story of three brothers, two older brothers and one much younger brother, and the younger brother was Greg, the main character of the story. And the boy's mother had died when Greg was, I think, about 8 years old. And now I might forget some of the details from the story as I wrote it in the book, but I'm doing my best to recreate it. So their mother died when Greg was about 8 years old, and they were left with their father raising the three of them. So the two older brothers were in their teens. Greg was 8 when his mom died. And Greg was really different from his older brothers. They really related well to their dad, but Greg had been closest to his mom. He was sensitive, he loved music, and he'd been very close to his mom. So it was devastating for Greg at that young age to lose his mom and then be left with his dad and older brothers who all connected and all felt like cohesive in the family, and he felt like an outsider. So he spent his whole life really growing up not fitting in well. And in his teens, he ended up rebelling against the family. He ran away from home. He ran to a bigger city where he lived on the streets. He got involved with drugs and alcohol and lived on the streets and was kind of selling his body for sex to get money for drugs, and really living a very desperate life on the streets. And meanwhile, his older brothers had kind of disowned him. Their father died at some point during this time. They didn't even know where he was. They didn't try to contact him to tell him that their dad had died. They wanted nothing to do with him. But a number of years later, so the two brothers lived next door to each other, and a number of years later, a knock came on one of the brothers' doors, and it was Greg. And Greg had developed AIDS, probably from using dirty needles on the street. And he'd had it for a few years. Or, no, excuse me. Sorry, I'm mixing that up with a different... Greg didn't have AIDS. He had developed melanoma, which was the same cancer their mother had died from. Sorry, I forgot that. But Greg, the melanoma started in exactly the same place as his mother's melanoma under his right arm. And so he had the same cancer that started in the same place as their mother developed. But he had never received treatment. He had no money or insurance. He'd never been to a doctor. He just had this cancer that was growing throughout his body and into his lung that had really, really taken over his right lung. And he was very sick and very desperate when he knocked on his brother's door to ask for help. His brother was angry and wanted to send him away, because he had disowned Greg and didn't really want to see him. But the brother's wife was there and pushed her husband out of the way, and she said, "Come in, you are welcome here." And she brought him in, and that's when she's the one who called our hospice in to come and help care for Greg. And he was really very sick and very close to the end of life. So we started getting involved at that point, and then heard about this story, how he'd been the prodigal son, the black sheep of the family. And the wife, Nancy, really went out of her way to take care of Greg, to create a little room for him, a hospice room where we could come in and care for him. She looked after him and provided most of the care for him. The brother was still angry and didn't want to have anything to do with Greg. But one night, the brother woke up in the middle of the night. He heard a noise, and Nancy was sleeping soundly, and he heard Greg calling for help. And the brother was tempted to wake Nancy up to, go help Greg, he needs you, but felt bad because she was working so hard and was so exhausted that he decided to get up and see what Greg needed. He walked out in the hall and found Greg crumpled up on the floor. He had tried to get up by himself to go to the bathroom and was too weak to stand up, so he had just fallen on the floor and was lying there helpless and couldn't get himself back up. So Greg reached down, the brother reached down and picked Greg up in his arms to carry him back to bed. And Greg wrapped his arms around his brother's shoulders as his brother was carrying him. And in that instant, in that moment of just reaching out with that concern and compassion and love, suddenly all of the brother's anger and hatred just vanished. And he said it just broke him open to hold his little brother in his arms. And he started weeping, and Greg started weeping. He carried Greg back to bed, and they ended up sitting up the rest of the night talking to each other. And they talked through everything. They talked through their mom dying and how traumatic it was for all of them. They talked about their dad. They talked about all the pain that they had experienced over the years in being separated and estranged from one another. And had this amazing bond that was forming here at the very end of Greg's life. And as the sun was coming up the next morning, and they'd been up all night talking, there was a knock at the door. And when the brother went to the door, it was the third brother who lived next door, who for some reason woke up that morning and said, I need to see Greg. And so the third brother came into the fold, and all three of them were able to have this time of reconciliation. It was an amazing story for us. We were really just bystanders hearing about all of it. Nancy conveyed a lot of this story to us, and as well as her husband. Greg ended up dying shortly thereafter. I think he may have lived another week after that reconciliation with his brothers. It was such a powerful lesson, though, that this coming together and forgiveness and healing our wounds and healing all those old resentments can happen very quickly, as much as we think it's such a formidable task to try to forgive someone that we have years worth of anger toward. It can actually happen so quickly when we just reach out to one another. And so that story was just so powerful, such a powerful lesson to me of how we can come together at the end of life because of our love for one another, because of our willingness to give to one another. So that was one of my favorite stories. I don't know if there's anything else you remember from it, Kim, that you wanted to mention.
No, that was great. I just thought that was a beautiful story, and it just really brought all three of the lessons that you talked about together. So I think that was beautiful. I think that was just beautiful. Yeah. So there were some practices that we had talked about that you thought were, some practical things for people to be able to take away from tonight's call based on some of those lessons that you just spoke about.
Yes, and I wanted to mention that, we have to remember that just reading about or hearing about spiritual growth and spiritual ideas, and even for me, learning about these ideas from patients, isn't really enough to make changes in our lives. That we have to really dedicate ourselves. It's like you could read about running marathons all you wanted and study the science of it and everything about training for a marathon, but if you didn't actually practice and get out and do the running and do the work, you wouldn't be any better off at the end of all that study. You wouldn't be any closer to actually running a successful marathon. So it's the training and the practice that we do that makes the difference in our lives. What I have seen is that when we work on ourselves and we work on our own growth, not only do we live a fuller life and do we enjoy life completely and every moment of life, but it makes things go much more smoothly for us when we reach the end of life. So that's what I wanted to emphasize, this idea that it's really important for each one of us to have some sort of practice in our lives, and practice as a way of working on ourselves and working on the lessons that we need to learn. So I mentioned, first of all, the idea of being in the present moment. And here's this practice it's so simple that it sounds silly, probably sounds like not a practice at all, but it's simply taking deep breaths and learning how to utilize the breath to help you come more fully into the present moment. And so it's intentionally taking a longer, slower, deeper breath than you might normally take during the day. So you sit down for a moment and withdraw from whatever else you're doing and focus on your breathing. And maybe in the beginning you count 5 counts in and 5 counts out. And as you take this deeper breath, and do that for 3 times. And maybe when you get more skilled at it, you'll be counting to 10 for each breath. But it's simply the act of taking that little moment away from whatever you're doing. It brings all of your focus into the present, because you're counting the breaths and you're focusing on taking the air in and letting it back out again. And it also calms anxiety, because taking a deep breath stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system, which helps us get calmer. And so I use it all the time, like before I have a speaking engagement or before I do, well, this hangout or radio show, I always take a moment and take a very slow, deep breath, because it immediately calms me down and it brings me out of my head and out of all my fearful thoughts into the moment of, this is what I'm doing right now. I need to be here fully present. So I can't emphasize how simple it is and yet how important it is to just use deep breathing off and on throughout the day and focus in on it, taking some deep breaths during the day as a calming mechanism. And so that's a great one for reminding you to stay in the present moment. I'm trying to make these short and simple so that they're easy things to remember. And a practice for love, similarly simple, it's simply to place your hands over your heart. That gesture, it's a type of in yoga, and they call it a mudra, but it's a gesture that you make with your hands, placing your hands over your heart. Actually, in studies by the Heart Math Institute, they've shown that simply putting your hands on your heart, that action releases oxytocin, which is the love hormone. It's the hormone in our bodies that helps us feel more loving and more connected to other people. So you can combine this, putting your hands over your heart, with the deep breathing. And when you do take a few deep breaths, just put your hand on your heart. It will help you feel calmer and in the moment, and also more open and loving toward others. Very, very simple, easy things that you could do anytime during the day. But both of these are really helpful if you're working in hospice or working with patients or even family members. If someone is in pain or upset, you can help them take some deep breaths, which will help them relax, help alleviate some of their pain. And you can do the breathing with them and just ask them to count with you and focus on their breath. You can also ask them to put their hand over their heart, and you can put your hand on top of theirs so that you're infusing them with your loving energy too. It's great with a child who's upset to hold a child on your lap and put your hands over the heart of the child. And that can really help calm and soothe a child very quickly. So those two little practices are so simple, but something I find very, very, very helpful. So that covers our first two, the staying in the present moment and love. And then forgiveness, this is a more challenging lesson. Forgiveness, I think, is one of those things that we stumble over and have to work on for a long time. But there's a practice called Ho'oponopono that I love to use, and I don't know if you have heard it. It comes from Hawaii, so Ho'oponopono is a Hawaiian word. And as far as I know, it means to make things right. And in this practice, you say simply these 4 statements: I'm sorry, I love you, please forgive me, and thank you. Those 4 statements. And you repeat those in your mind while you're visualizing the person that you may have maybe had a falling out with, or someone that you're angry with. And you simply say, I'm sorry, I love you, please forgive me, thank you. And you use those 4 statements even if you believe the other person has harmed you or wronged you, and you feel innocent. You don't feel that you've done anything wrong that you should need to apologize for. Because what this practice does, it kind of clears the air of the negative energy that's coming from you, the resentment and the hurt and the negative energy and the anger that's coming from you. It's an acknowledgement that I will be responsible for whatever I'm feeling. I take responsibility for what I'm feeling. And I want you to feel love from me no matter what has happened between us. So again, that's a fairly simple practice for a complex problem, forgiveness, which is something difficult to work on. But I wanted to give you some easy things that you could remember that would be simple to do as a way to foster these lessons in your own day-to-day life. So those are the 3 easy things.
Great, thank you. Yes, and simple as always. Wonderful that being able to just take a moment to breathe, being able to just put your hand over your heart, as you said, and then the Hawaiian mantra. I think that's beautiful, and some real practical things that our listeners can take away with and put into practice for themselves, as well as you said, working with others. So that's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Karen.
You're welcome.
So I'm just being mindful of the time, and I'm just checking in to see. We do have a question that's come in, and I'd certainly encourage the rest of our listeners to type in some comments or questions. But we do have a question here from Nancy, if I can get to that. It says, along the lines of denial of death, would you please address the euphemisms that are used to avoid saying the words death, died, and dead, etc.?
That's interesting because I do, of course, we hear that all the time in our society, as people have such a hard time even using the words, it's very interesting, isn't it? And I think it just epitomizes how we try to soften the subject somehow and avoid our fear of it by creating other words like passing, passing on, something like that. It's interesting because I had one of the guests that I interviewed for End of Life University kept using the words passed. My grandmother passed, or someone else passed. And I was really curious about her, but I realized that she works all the time with lay people out in the public, and she decided to use those softer words because she didn't want to scare anyone else away. So I had asked her about that, why she wasn't saying death, dying, dead, and saying those words. And she said her audience and her public are people who are not used to talking about the subject, and she thought it was easier if she eased them into it gradually in a way that they would be comfortable with. I don't know about that. I'm kind of in favor of saying death and dying and saying the words exactly as they are for myself. So I think that those of us who are comfortable with the conversation need to stand up and actually use our words, death, dying, and dead, to help everyone else get used to it, to help everyone else get used to listening to that so they don't feel it's not jarring for them to hear someone use those words. Kim, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I certainly would agree with what you're saying, that we're really trying to open the door to conversation, so let's use words that, are not kind of, softening is not the right word, but just let's use the words and describe what actually is occurring, as opposed to, some euphemisms or some things that, may not convey what it is that we're really trying to, in some ways normalize, and we're trying to really open the door for people to feel comfortable. So using the words versus, something else that would just perpetuate kind of either our lack of comfort or trying to protect someone else's comfort, just being able to be respectful, but being able to utilize the appropriate words. So yeah, I would absolutely agree. I would agree. Great. Let's see what else we have here. We have a few comments that have come in from people. Let's see here. People are saying thank you very much. Um, Rhea wrote in, love is the answer. Jane said the power of living love. Life is short, have dessert first. Let's talk about living in the present moment. Yeah.
Mm.
Let's see. Does anyone please, feel free to type in any questions or more comments. Just keep kind of coming in here, so I'm just trying to scroll. Joe Carroll says, it occurs to me that the four things to say can also be useful in everyday life when people have disagreements that damage their lives. Yeah, great. Great. Jane has a question here. Do you notice that different cultures use different words about death? She recently had a client share that the mother had expired. The word was the first for her. Have we ever heard of that?
That's interesting. I guess I haven't. I guess I don't normally use the word expired. That definitely seems like a very clinical term. That I can picture being used in hospitals. The patient expired at 10:07. And I don't have enough knowledge about other cultures. I am sure that there are other words in other cultures, but also other concepts about death and dying as well, that could be lacking in our society. Just like, we have one word for love, which limits us in many ways because love has so many different faces and different forms and varieties, though it's all one love, but love manifests in so many different ways that we have a hard time talking about the difference between, oh, I love McDonald's hamburgers and, I love my children. We have only one word that conveys that whole spectrum of sentiments. And I don't love McDonald's hamburgers. I just use that as an example. But I would imagine, and I'm not the expert on this, that other cultures do have perhaps more words or more descriptive words for death and dying than we have in our society, and that would be a really, really interesting to look into.
Yeah. Definitely a great topic for even another call or another webinar, to really see if folks have some interest in being able to have that dialogue and share experiences from other cultures. So great. Let's see. Michael has typed in, I found myself using the word transitioned more lately. So that's another,
I like that word. I like that word also because it does convey, for those of us who see something beyond this life, it conveys that it's part of a process that's happening, not just a termination, not just the end.
Great. Super. Well, this is comments, and thank you for all of you that have typed in from the various locations around the country and the world. I wasn't able to read all of those, but thank you so much for joining in this important conversation. So, being mindful of the time, Karen, I was just curious if there's some parting words you'd want to kind of wrap up with as we kind of come to the end of our time together tonight.
Well, I guess I would say primarily that my hope is that each one of us really learns how to make the most of every moment of life. And back when I was learning from my hospice patients what they seem to know, I remember wondering, can we only learn these things when we know we're dying? Can we only learn this when we're at the very end of life? Is that why they seem to be learning so much so quickly and having transformations, because they are dying? And do I have to wait until I'm dying to learn those lessons? But then what I realized is that each one of us, of course, is mortal and will die. And none of us know when. And so life itself it's so precious, every moment of it. So my encouragement and what I hope, and it's what I hoped for from my book, is that every person would come away with a sense of wanting to live fully in every moment and experience joy and love in every single moment of life, so that when the end does come, it will not feel like a surprise or a disappointment, but feel like the culmination of a life that has been well lived. So that's what I would leave everyone with. That's my wish for them.
Beautiful, beautiful parting words. Yes, and let's discuss how people can get more information. They can reach out and connect with you, your website, and also I think you were going to offer something to our listeners tonight.
Oh yes, yes. I was going to show there's my book, What Really Matters. If you go to my website, which is KarenWyattMD.com, you can sign up. There's a little sign-up form, and you can receive a workbook. It's called the What Really Matters Workbook, which has practices for the 7 lessons from the book. If you've read the book, it's a great companion for the book, but the workbook you can even use on its own. And it's if you haven't read the book, it has the 7 lessons and practices like those I was describing that you can use every day to help you with these lessons. So that's just a free gift if you go to KarenWyattMD.com and sign up. Then I would encourage you, if you're interested in hearing these conversations, you can sign up for End of Life University too at the EOLUniversity.com. I think Kim displayed that in the chat box at that URL. So that's the website where you can go sign up for free, and you'll get notification about each new interview as it comes up during the year.
Great. Thank you, Karen. Again, that's KarenWyattMD.com, and you can get all her information. And I'd strongly encourage you, there's lots of resources and information in addition to the End of Life University tab on her website. So, check it out, and you will not be disappointed with the resources and the things that Karen has to offer there. So great. So as we wrap up, I just want certainly I'll thank Karen again, but just encourage all of you again. This was our launch of this monthly free webinar series, and so next month our guest, February 12th, will be Kathy Nitz. Will be joining us. Kathy's a life strategist and a coach, and she's a certified senior advisor. But most importantly, she's a caregiver to her mom with dementia. So we'll be discussing bridging generations through conversations. So, please join us for that. Kathy's created a set of caring cards, which are similar to a deck of playing cards, that promote meaningful connections and provide an opportunity to preserve the loved one's legacy. So be looking for that registration link, and if it speaks to you, we'd love to have you join us for that call, which will be February 12th. And if any of you have any ideas, thoughts for topics or other guests that you know, I'd love to hear from you. Please certainly send me an email. You can see that my email address, or my website, I should say, is www.yourgriefandlosscoach.com, and my email is kim@yourgriefandlosscoach.com. So, please don't hesitate to reach out. Anything that you feel, again, this is an educational opportunity, and it's my gift to really be able to have these speakers and have these topics of interest in the death and dying and end of life arena, again, as I said, to open the door to conversation. So this is really for you and for anyone that would be interested. So feel free to send me an email, and be happy to chat and have a conversation. Again, if there's anything of importance to you. So Karen, I just want to say tremendous thank you again to you tonight. For being here and helping us kick off this series on this important conversation, and you are such a valued member, absolutely, of the community around the end of life, and so it's just been my pleasure to have you on and to hear about some of the lessons that you've learned, from your patients. That applies to all of us, and if we begin to live those now, it just is helpful as we approach life. We don't need to wait till the end in order to do this. So big congratulations and thank you so much to you. And it's just been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Kim. It's been a pleasure for me too. It's been wonderful, and congratulations on your new series.
Thank you. Thank you. Great. Okay, so we will wrap it up now, and I hope to see, I hope to hear from most of you for our February event. So thank you again, everyone, for joining in, and the replay will be sent out, so you can listen to this again or share with those that you think would benefit, and certainly those, especially our colleagues and friends over in Europe, and it's the middle of the night for them, so they'll be listening to the replay. So big welcome to all them when they do, and look forward to seeing or hearing from all of you in February. Thanks so much, and good night, everyone.
Good night.